think that, to me, it's a kind of an interesting coincidence that I work somewhere named after Black Swan theory. It wasn't named after Black Swan theory, but it goes well with Black Swan theory. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So I think that as Indigenous people, we have a whole bunch of Indigenous knowledge, because we've lived on the continents that we lived on since humans have been around, right? And we have maintained that connection to the land that has given us knowledge systems and ways of doing things that could be of real benefit to the mainstream. And I think we're at a point now where we can say that, yeah, Western science has given us a lot of the good stuff, but Western science has also really screwed a lot of things up. Like if you say, look at the way the climate is changing right now, like, I mean, that's not due to traditional knowledge, that's due to Western science, right? So I think that we have a lot to offer as Indigenous people if people start to recognize our knowledge systems. I was going to tell you a really good story about this doctoral student, what she's doing her research on. And then I thought, I can't actually remember her name, so maybe I better not tell you her, because I don't want you to steal her ideas. Yeah, no, I better not tell you that. But I think that, I think that we have a lot to offer humanity in general as Indigenous people, because the way our knowledge systems work is built around relationships. So I think that that's something that's really lacking in Western science, is knowledge about how to behave yourself. So I think that that's what we really have to offer, and that's a big benefit that we could share with other people. But I also have to recognize that there are a lot of barriers. Like the system is the way the system is, and it is built to keep other knowledges out. And we have to recognize also as Indigenous academics, like, I mean, we have a vested interest in the system because it pays our salary. So there's like, yeah, okay. You have to be careful who you're talking to sometimes, right? Because it's, yeah. Well, those of you who are Indigenous academics will know what I mean. It's like you got to be careful who you're talking to or what you talk about stuff. Right. So there are sort of some barriers to the way these things that I'm talking about. But it's hopefully if you can come in with an open mind, you can see past certain things. So I guess to me, okay, well, you got to start thinking about Indigenous knowledge then. So if we're thinking about engaging with Indigenous people, we know that understand there's been this history of the total denigration of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science as well. Okay, well, let's start thinking about, well, what is Indigenous knowledge then? Like we could talk about traditional Indigenous knowledge, which is knowledge that's based on the land and it's about the land. But we can start to also talk about, okay, what Indigenous knowledge is, and Indigenous peoples are part of living cultures. So we're living, breathing, so we're not artifacts of the past. We have to get beyond thinking of traditional Indigenous knowledge as an artifact of the past and how things used to be. And Indigenous knowledge is what allows us to live as Indigenous people in the world today. So what is it about Indigenous knowledge then, okay? And to me, it's all about relationships. So I can use a lot of big words, but if you think about the nature of reality itself, like Western science is really based on the whole idea that there is one true reality, and it's like you can objectively study that one reality. Whereas Indigenous ontology or epistemology, ways of thinking about reality, is based on the idea not that there's one true external reality, but that reality is the relationships that we're in. So we aren't just in relationships, we are relationships. Everything is relationships. Everything is relations. So it's not just relations between people, we are that, but we're also relations with the land and our environment around us. We're relationships with our ancestors and our descendants. We are the relationships that we hold with the cosmos. But we have to expand that even further and think about we are the relationships that we hold with ideas and with abstractions. That makes us who we are. That guides how we think, those relationships. So to me, the relationships, if you just keep that in mind, it's all about relationships, then everything else falls into place, okay? So if that is the nature of reality, then it becomes a lot more important to think about the relationships. Oh, okay, well then how do you behave? To me, that is a really important question. How am I going to behave myself? How do I behave in a manner that is like entering into respectful relationships? Because that's how you get the truth. If reality is relationships, then a good relationship is going to lead to the truth. A bad relationship is going to lead to an abusive place that's going to be abusing the truth, okay? So you have to really think about how you behave. So I think that ethics and protocols are really important for Indigenous people, but in a different way, not in a sort of universalistic, these are laws of behavior, but in a way of how do you behave as a nice person, okay? So that becomes a fundamental thing to think about when you're thinking about engagement is how do I behave myself, right? And then how do we teach other people how to behave? How do we teach other people to recognize that they're in relationships? How do we teach other people how to learn new stuff? Okay. So it's all about how do we engage in relationships. To me, that's the crucial key point to understanding how to engage with Indigenous people is to think about how do I engage in a relationship. If you can think about that, then everything else will kind of fall into place. Okay? So I was thinking, okay, well, what are some examples of that? Then I was thinking, oh man, okay, that makes it a bit harder. So I thought maybe I could tell you about 4 different little stories about engagement and about relationships and about teaching. So in relationships and educational settings. So I was racking my brain about this and I think, oh, okay, what are some good examples? And so I thought, okay, well, the first example I could think of is, well, I was thinking, okay, I can remember the name of my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Taylor. I can remember it, but the first teacher that really stands out in my experience as being an exceptional teacher was when I was in 3rd grade. And Mrs. Curran, and I was thinking, oh, well, how the heck was okay, Mrs. Curran, but I don't know what her name is. So I actually emailed the school. Can you look back in your records who Mrs. Curran was? So it was Betty Nora Curran, or Nora Betty, I can't remember now. I should have written it down. So she taught at Hope School in California. That when my parents were working on their doctorates, we went down to California. I took 3rd grade there, but Mrs. Curran in her classroom, she was a 3rd grade teacher, but she also owned a nursery. So every week, she would take a group of some of the students from the classroom with her to the nursery. So we'd like in a van full of students to the nursery, and we had our own little garden plot there. So every week we'd do something different. So it went right through from planting seedlings and getting seedlings going in the nursery, and then planting them out into our little garden plot, and then growing them up. And people every week would have to go and weed, and if they need watering, we'd go watering. So learning about that hands-on relationship with Earth was really important to her, and for me that was a really exciting thing to learn. And then at the end of the year, it wasn't at the end of the year, but it was partway through the year when the things started to ripen. It was time to harvest things. Then she let us take those things that we as 3rd graders were really proud of growing these things, and then we got to take them home and give them back to our families. And to me, that was a really important thing, and it was a really good lesson that I think a lot of teachers could learn from. Is it's like for Indigenous students, it's not just about learning, because learning in itself is meh, whatever. But if you can learn how to provide for your family, I think that is one thing that every Indigenous student I've ever talked to, they don't go to university to make things better for themselves. They go to make things better for their children. They go to make things better for their grandchildren or their community. So, okay, that was a good lesson for me. And when I think back on it now about how do we make an education so that we're encouraging students and giving them the tools to give things back to their family, give things back to their community. That needs to be part of how we engage with education. Okay, so that was one example. And then the next person, so, go from 3rd grade, and I can't remember any of my teachers' names again. It's like, okay, they must not have had that big of impact. The next teacher's name I can remember was when I was in 11th grade. And his name was Ron Johnson. And so what was it about him that was memorable? What made his lessons stand out? And it wasn't the lessons that he taught. I can't remember anything I learned in year 11. I doubt if you can either, right? But what was memorable from what I learned from him is he opened up his classroom at lunchtime and after school, and there was always just like a group of kids that came there and hung out. Now, by the time I was in 11th grade, there wasn't any other Aboriginal students around other than the ones that were in like the vocational stream at school. So because I was in the sort of more academic stream, I was like usually the only Indigenous kid in most of my classes. So it was really important for me to have this place where I went at lunchtime, I went after school sometimes, to build that sense of community. So what he was able to do through opening his class, and he really didn't like do anything in particular, like mostly he was like marking papers or something, but he'd always make little wisecracks with us and stuff. What he did was he allowed us to build a sense of community in the school, because it was a massive school. And to have like this one little place that I felt like I could go and belong and felt a sense of belonging was really important for me. So that sense of building a community within often, well, it was like, I don't know, there was like 1,500 kids at the high school or whatever, but so I didn't feel connected to the high school. I played on some of the sports teams and felt a little bit connected there, but for me it was that one classroom where he built a sense of community. That, to me, was the most important thing I remembered out of high school. And I was thinking, okay, so what can we learn about engagement from that, and the importance of giving our students a sense of community in our institutions. So like, yeah, you can identify with MSU as a whole, but it's like, yeah, really, how many students are there here, and do you feel a sense of community with individuals? And it's like, yeah, probably not. So how can we create a sense of community with students in smaller groups so they can actually, they're like real people? So that's something to consider. Okay, so then when I went through high school, and then, so the next sort of story I was thinking about is like, okay, so I went and did my Bachelor of Science degree. I was thinking, so who stood out for me as a good teacher there? And I was thinking, I cannot remember a single professor that I had when I was doing my bachelor's degree. And I think that says a lot. Well, I mean, maybe I shouldn't say the university, but I will. It was University of Manitoba. There, I was like one of a sea of 1,500 students in most of the units that I was in, and they couldn't give a shit who I was. I was there as a number, and so it was for me a really good sort of, well, it wasn't a good experience, but thinking back on it, what I learned from that is what happens when there's a total lack of engagement. There was no efforts made by the university to engage with undergraduate students. I think that the year I started there was two different programs started, an engineering access program for Aboriginal kids and medical, I can't remember what, it was a pre-medical program as well. But so there was they were trying to get some Indigenous students in that, but I wasn't in either of those programs, so I didn't really fit in anywhere. There certainly wasn't anything in the hard sciences that was trying to encourage sense of community amongst the students, and it was more like a sense of competition amongst the students, try and get the best marks, right? So it was like, there's some lessons that I gained from a bad example, okay? So, and I can't remember any of my professors. So then, I'll say, well, Cree people always talk about stuff in fours, so I got to think of 4 examples. After I finished my bachelor's degree, I just screwed around for a while, as young people do, and I went back and really didn't like the hard sciences by the time I finished my bachelor's degree, because it was just, there was a total lack of connecting the content that we were learning into any sort of context of how that knowledge could be used. So anyway, so I decided to do my master's degree in community psychology. And I thought, okay, that sounds interesting. How do you think about psychology in a community level? To me, that was exciting. So I went to University of Alaska Fairbanks. And then I was thinking, all right, here is a really good example of engagement again. Because when I was at Fairbanks, there was they had a center that was called Rural Student Services, because there's a lot of Alaska Natives that come in from really small communities to come into university, right? So there could only be 200 or 300 people in their community. So they recognize that these kids wouldn't necessarily know very many people in the big cities. So Fairbanks is a massive city of 70,000 people or something at the time, right? So how can we help these kids to build a sense of community? So they had Rural Student Services, and Rural Student Services, every month they had a feast. And they recognized that that was a traditional part of how Indigenous people engage with each other, is we have feasts and we sit together and we share and we hang out and tease each other, and that's what we do, right? So they had feasts every month, and it was a really good way of building community. But the other thing that it did, and I didn't think about this till quite a bit later, was that, say for example, I went out to Fort Yukon one time, and I was talking with interviewing an elder for part of my thesis, and you know, we were in his house and having tea and whatever. You know, after a couple hours of talking, I was getting ready to go, and he said, "Do you like dried caribou?" And I was like, "Yeah." He said, "Okay, wait a minute, so I'll get you some." So I thought, you know, he's going to get me like a couple little pieces of dried caribou. He went and got a pillowcase, and he filled up the pillowcase with about, you know, 5 or 6 pounds of dried caribou meat. So I was like, I got this great big Santa Claus sack of dried caribou meat taken home with me. So I took that down with me on the, because it's a fly-in, fly-out community. I flew back down to Fairbanks, and the next time there was the feast at Rural Student Services, I brought along all this caribou with me. And thinking about how that made me feel as, you know, again, being able to help provide for the other students. And I was thinking, when I thought back at it, every student, usually when they went home, someone from the community would send something in. So whether it was people from the coast, they would send in whale meat. Or it was people that, you know, lived in the interior, they would send in some caribou or some moose or some muskrat or beaver or whatever. But how that gave the community an opportunity to give back to the students. So they recognized that these students were away from home and they're missing their traditional food. So there was an opportunity for this community to give back in a meaningful way. Like, you know, you can say the community is giving by giving us your students and your tuition fees, but that's not meaningful for most people. That's like the opposite of meaningful. But the fact that they could give some of the traditional foods and that they were really appreciated was a meaningful way of engaging. And the other thing that they had there was elders in residence. So they had a house on campus where every semester they brought in 2 different elders to come and live on campus, and they took place in a lot of were included in a lot of the classes, but they were also there that, you know, anyone could go and just talk with them. So the university then, I would say, so they appreciated the food that the community was providing, but they also really demonstrated that they appreciated Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous teachings as they were provided by the elders. So that, to me, is another really good example of, so like when I think back of those individual teachers, that's a good examples of individuals engaging with students, building community, engaging with knowledge so that you're able to give back and use it to help your community. A lack of engagement. But at Alaska, it was, like, I can think of lots of different professors there too, but to me, it's a really good example of an institutional way of thinking about engagement.